Hello and welcome back to Speed Demon Painting. Today we are continuing our installment of looking at the different rules changes that came in the big fall update for Dystopian Wars version 3.03. I made a small mistake in the previous one by calling it version 3.3 and it was pointed out to me that it's actually version 3.03, so there we go. Now, in version 3.03 there were quite a few rules changes made to the big rulebook, and I've discussed those in two previous videos, divided up into some big changes where there were massive rule reworks, but also into smaller and subtle changes that are still going to have a big impact on the rules regardless, yeah, link in to those videos as well below. Now, a third way that the rules were changed was through the ORBATs. There were quite a few rules in there that are commonly found in multiple fleets, and these two also have small tweaks to them, which is what we'll be going through in this video. Now, the main reason why I'm going over the main ORBAT changes in this one is that I plan to revisit all of the ORBAT deep dives that I did in the past for this big fall update, and so one video that has some of the more common changes found in them can be useful, so I don't have to keep mentioning them every single time. Also, if you want to see these ORBAT deep dives coming up, they will be next, and if you do, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for those future updates as well. At number 8, I have two rules that were changed in some of the previous ORBATs that got changed sort of intermediate between the January updates and these August updates, and those are the updates to Spotter and Unexpected Arrival. Spotter now requires that there's an SRS token on the target that you're trying to shoot at with the weapons that gain the sustained quality if they have extreme range quality as well. So you do need SRS on target. It's a lot less dangerous now though, because the big rulebook was changed to make sure that the big dangerous thing, i.e. the Sturginium flare that could destroy all the SRS tokens, no longer does that, so it's pretty much safer. But on the flip side, it is sustained, was nerfed in that big rulebook a bit as well, so it's not quite as powerful as before, but you're also not going to nuke all of your SRS tokens if you're targeting it with other weapons. So it's a bit of a, give with one hand, take with the other in that regards. Also, and that's a big important one, if the target is in spotter range or has an SRS token to it, it can no longer benefit from the obscured rule anymore. So if you've got something that is quite hard to hit because of obscured, spotter takes care of that. And the other generic rule that was changed is Unexpected Arrival. It was very strong and it's been slightly nerfed because you can only now fire any of your weapons using the crippled stats instead of the full-blown battle-ready stats. And you now have to stay outside 2 inch of terrain, which is a good thing that they've loosened that restriction slightly, because there's way more terrain, up to 7 mass in every quadrant now. So placing those big ships, like for instance the Murmansk, was getting quite tricky if that was within 3 inch, so that one was loosened a bit. At number 7, I have the change to Shroud Generators. This is found across all factions, and Shroud Generators now grant the Obscured bonus to any ships equipped with it. And Obscured works slightly differently now. In the previous rules update 1.02, it was already changed to no longer downgrade exploding hits to heavy hits. It's now just so that you can't roll any additional dice for each exploding hits. But those exploding hits still count as being exploding hits, so qualities like Devastating still work against obscured targets. And the Shroud Generator specifically states that it doesn't protect against assaults and SRS. So regaining the obscured bonus is definitely a big strong point to it, although there's a few caveats to this one as well, so yeah, I expect to see Shroud Generators taken quite a lot as well in this edition, because that protection against, rolling additional dice is a pretty strong one. And at number 6, just like how Spotter was reworked to circumvent that obscured bonus, Maritime Patrol was also reworked. Now, if a ship has Maritime Patrol, if there's an SRS token against a target, or if the ship with the rule itself is within 10 inch of the initial target, it can now ignore the submerged position trait on the target. That is quite a big deal, because that means that submerged targets are usually always obscured, and they are no longer that for any ships with Maritime Patrol. But it also has a few other benefits as well, because you can even fire aerial weapons now at submerged targets. And that is a pretty big deal. Feel free to take those rocket batteries, because usually those submerged targets do not really have any stellar air defense values to begin with, so they can be quite vulnerable to these aerial weapons if you target them with that. So yeah, I like this one. Maritime Patrol is now significantly different to Spotter, which is a good new change for it. At number 5 we have a new ability called Fortunes of War, although it's not really that much of a new ability. It used to be called Command and Control, and that means that you could cancel some Valor effects. Now every faction has a few ships with this new Fortunes of War, and it sort of also explains slightly better what it does. It just means that these ships can have the good fortune on their side by cancelling Valor effects from the enemy. Now, the rules for countering Valor effects are not written in the ORBATs anymore, because that is now part of the big rulebook as well. What you have to do is, if somebody uses a Valor effect, you have to look at the initiative value found on the card with which the Valor effect was activated. If your ship has an ability to, or your fleet rather, has an ability to counter it, you need to exceed that initiative value by either playing one card that just has a straight up higher value, or by playing multiple smaller cards until you exceed that big value. Meaning, if you want your Valor effect to go through, you better chuck a big card at it in terms of initiative number to make sure that that works. There is a variant of Fortunes of War, however, called Devil's Own Luck, which is, for instance, found on the Nautilus, which is available as a mercenary for any faction really, so you should have access to it. Devil's Own Luck can only be used once during the turn, instead of just every time like Fortunes of War, but you can use any old card to counter the Valor effect without looking at the initiative value, so it's a very strong variant. We have been playing with two fleets that both had a ship with Fortunes of War in it, and it does trigger a very interesting mini game where your card management starts becoming a very big deal, because you don't just want to throw cards at anything and you want to think these through slightly better. So it has a big impact on how the game is played, but it was sort of a variation of something we knew already, which is why I only put it at number 5. At number 4 I have some changes to things that had to do with how SRS was used, such as Combat Air Patrol. If you watched the first video out, the big major changes, the biggest change I thought that the game had was the rework of SRS tokens, and Combat Air Patrol had to be changed because of how SRS tokens are changed now. You can now launch them at 40 inch, which is a significant distance during the special operations step. And Combat Air Patrol allows you to do that at infinite range in the first turn. Now you might think that is incredibly strong then, infinite range, but it's not as big a deal as you think it would be. There's no downsides to launching with Combat Air Patrol. There used to be, but that's all gone. Then why the reasoning for the infinite range? Well, it pretty much just prevents certain gamey deployment shenanigans, like your opponent deploying at 40.5 inch with one ship, because he knows that you only have 40 inch to launch with your carriers in that first turn. So this Combat Air Patrol is more of a protection against some of those lame pre-measurement things that your opponent could have done if he just managed to, measure out what 40 inch was. And on top of that, there's a few other tweaks to SRS mine clearance as well. I've written the text here. You can now still send your SRS tokens to minefields within 20 inch, But you now throw every dice individually for each token, and as soon as you reach that exploding hit, you can do one or two things with the remaining tokens in that stack. They can either try to find a new mine token within 5 inch, or they can just stay there and just scramble to find new targets in the end phase, whichever you prefer as a player. So there was a bit of a tweak there, that SRS mine clearance has gotten a bit better. And something that hasn't changed at all, but which in my book is still better, is SRS recon flight. Now why is that? Why has something changed the same but is now better? Well, the actual cards that you are holding are way more important in this edition, because of the addition of Valor effects and, like we just seen, Fortunes of War, where you can cancel Valor effects. You will have turns where you just draw a really crappy hand with very low initiative numbers on it, and SRS Recon Flight is going to be your ticket out of it if you remember to use it. So don't forget about this new rule, or rather this old rule in this new version, because it is more significant than ever before. At number 3, I have the fact that special SRS tokens are no longer a thing. They are now just called other tokens, without referring to that word SRS, because there previously was quite a bit of confusing on what these special SRS, as they used to be called, can do and what they can't. Now, each ORBAT details which parts of the SRS rules that you can apply to these tokens, and if there are certain that are not stated, then you just can't do these things. Not all these tokens follow all the rules for SRS. If it's not mentioned, you just can't do it. You do get some pretty long descriptions now in the ORBATs for these tokens, but it does clear up a lot of the different rules that they can and can't do. As an example, I took the old whale tokens from the Enlightened, which are now spread up across multiple rules. So like I said, they are lengthy additions to each ORBAT, but they do describe how they work in quite a lot of detail. The first rule for these whale tokens are the Cetacean attack runs. These ships can now launch either whales or the visitor, whatever they are called, and orca tokens, just like you could with SRS tokens, it states. These construct tokens cannot be intercepted, so don't use the ADV value like you would for any other SRS values. SRS tokens rather. If the number of Cetacean construct tokens in the attack run is greater than the mass of the attack run target, the action dice pool also gains the devastating quality. So there's like an equivalent of the weight of fire rule, but it works slightly different for these tokens as well. And these Cetacean construct tokens cannot make attack runs on any aerial or skimming units, and they must try and find any new targets if a unit that they were sent to suddenly becomes, you know, a skimmer or a flying target. What are these whale tokens? Well, these have the ability to launch visitor construct tokens, which is a type of Cetacean construct, and they have a launch range of just 20 inch compared to the 40 inch of normal SRS tokens, and each token contributes 5 action dice with the submerged, piercing and sustained qualities to the attack run. Remember, if something has the submerged quality, you can use your submerged defense against it. So even though you cannot intercept these whale tokens like you would with any airplanes, you can defend yourself against them with your submerged defense value. Also a thing, they can be escort tokens. Visitors may only be destroyed if they're escort tokens if the triggering attack contains the submerged quality. And why can be sent out as the escort tokens? Well, you can send those Cetacean tokens to friendly targets, but then they don't behave like any other SRS tokens would if they were friendly SRS units. In these specific token cases, they temporarily become escorts for the unit that you send them to. So in other words, you can use them in a completely different way, which is now described in the ORBAT, and hopefully makes it a lot clearer for players reading it, like, alright, these aren't just SRS tokens, these are very much their own thing now. At number 2, I have the rework of all the different battle fleet bonuses that you can find. Generic faction fleets no longer give you any type of bonus when you're trying to make your fleet, and overall I have to say that most of these battle fleet bonuses are toned down quite a bit. Fleets now have rulebook restrictions that can actually be loosened as well as one of the bonuses for your fleet. Now these restrictions were restated in every ORBAT, which is one of the pictures I've included here. You cannot include more than one of any specific unit. You cannot include more than one unit with the flagship traits, unless the specific battle fleet allows you to do otherwise. And in addition to the flagship, you cannot include more than one unit with the aerial position trait. So even if you've got a flying flagship, you can still include one other aerial unit if you want to. Same deal with being submerged. In addition to the flagship, you cannot include more than one unit with the submerged unit position trait. So you can't just start spamming either flyers or submarines using these fleets. And any units forming an attached unit must come from the same battle fleet, as one final little tweak to it as well. A good thing though is, in general, all bonuses tied to having a max-sized unit of any type of unit are gone. And I think that's a brilliant thing, because well, some people did have a complaint about it, saying that if you buy a battle fleet box, you can't unlock the bonus of the battle fleet yet without purchasing another separate squadron to make it a full-size unit. And that's all of it. All of it's gone. And it just allows for way more flexible list building as well, because some of these themed battle fleets before, that for instance required you to have a, like for instance the Empire one had one with a Yangtze battle fleet requiring a maximum unit of 4 Merus, but 4 Merus are like 120 points each, and the Yangtze itself meant that you had a fleet of almost 800 points. That was just dictated just to get the little bonus. That's all gone now, so there's a lot more flexibility in your list building, which gets a big thumbs up for me at least. And then finally, at number 1, the biggest change that I think that came in ORBATS is there's no more heavy magazines as a rule. That's not to say that it was scrapped entirely. There is now a very similar rule called heavy firepower. And what is heavy firepower? It is a valor effect that you can activate with, any of the cards you have in your hands. The only thing that is of importance is that initiative value if you want to counter it. And what does the valor effect allow you to do? Well, in one of your attack dice pools, 3 weapons can fire at their lead value instead of having 2 of them contribute their support value instead. And this is of course limited to once per activation, so any particularly big ships can't just spam heavy firepower as a valor effect to go with it. This comes with a few cons with it. The first and most obvious being that it can now be countered if your opponent, or cancelled I should say, if your opponent has any fortunes of warships or ships with the devil's own luck. And you have to remember, you have to first declare your attacks before you can actually apply any valor effects to them. So there are no take backsies of like, I'm going to reallocate my attacks if you counter this ability. No, you just have to stick with it and just declare it before you can apply the valor effect. However, the big pro, and that makes it a lot more interesting in list building in my book, is that you can now do this with any type of weapon. The previous heavy magazines rule was restricted to heavy gun batteries and heavy rocket batteries, and you almost had to be somewhat of a dense person to upgrade some of those weapons, because suddenly your heavy magazines rule no longer worked. The most classic example of this was the Borodino flagship. You could take a Borodino and then upgrade the heavy gun batteries to railguns, but that wasn't a smart idea, because then your heavy magazine rule didn't work and it actually became worse for upgrading, and that's no longer a thing. And as a side note, it does come with the con of being able to be cancelled, but I can 100% see why they did it. There were a few cheese builds out there where people would just take 5 or 6 flagships with especially the very cheap ones like the previous Borodinos and the Ninjings, where you could just spam heavy magazine ships and have such obliterating firepower that there would almost be nothing left of the opposing fleet by turn 2, and that has been significantly toned down as well with this new heavy magazines, well rather heavy firepower rule, because you can't just spam it. And there you go, those are the big changes that I think are the most important ones in these ORBATs, and yeah, that means that we're now ready to do the deep dives. Hopefully you've enjoyed this short 3 video series on the general rules, and like I said before, if you want to see the deep dives, make sure you hit the thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for those updates as well. I hope to see you on the next one. Bye!